Briar Ridge, Montana Territory, October 1887. While every settler rushed to finish their cabins before the first snow, William Hodges was doing something no one understood. 7 weeks into construction, when most families were already chopping wood for winter, Hodges was still hauling flat stones from the riverbed. Heavy, uneven, back-breaking loads that had no place, people thought, in a frontier cabin. He made trip after trip, stacking the stones beside his unfinished home. Not logs, not shingles, not grain, stones. And the settlement began to talk. Why stones? Why so many? And why waste precious time when winter was only weeks away? January 1888. The worst winter in living memory. Wind screamed through Briar Ridge with a fury that shook walls and rattled doors. Snow sealed cabins shut. Parents pressed their children closer to the hearth to stop their shivering. Woodpiles vanished faster than anyone had prepared for. The cold wasn't an inconvenience anymore. It was a threat. But in the middle of the storm, one cabin looked different. A faint amber glow pulsed through its frosted windows. No frantic shadows of people feeding a dying fire. No smoke billowing in panic. Just a quiet, steady warmth. Inside, children slept peacefully on a long stone platform lining one wall. Boots dried by radiant heat. Blankets lay loose, not clutched. The air was comfortable, still, almost luxurious compared to the misery outside. This was William Hodges' cabin, the same one the community had mocked, the same one they said would never work, the same one they swore would cost him his life. How did a man once ridiculed for wasting space on a pile of rocks end up outsmarting the deadliest winter the territory had ever seen? To understand, we must return to the moment he arrived. William Hodges appeared in Briar Ridge with little fanfare, quiet, observant, polite. Mid-30s, a single wagon, a set of well-traveled tools, and a leather-bound journal filled with sketches most settlers assumed were maps till they saw his build. Most newcomers followed a simple formula. 4 walls up in a week, roof on by the next, chimney and hearth by the third. Because on the frontier, winter wasn't patient. Speed meant survival. But Hodges didn't build like a desperate man. He built like a man with a plan. Each day, he measured twice, marked the ground, placed every board intentionally. And then, he started on the hearth. Not a small brick box like the others. Not a simple open, but a massive stone structure, laid from the ground up with careful precision. The base alone was the size of a bed. Then it grew, and kept growing. Within 2 weeks, nearly a quarter of his cabin was consumed by this rising stone giant. To the people of Briar Ridge, it was madness. At first, neighbors gathered to watch in casual curiosity. But curiosity soon twisted into something sharper. It'll freeze by January. You could house a family in the space that hearth takes. Is he building a cabin or a blacksmith's forge? Some laughed as they passed. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few whispered to their spouses that they might need to keep an eye on that fellow, in case his foolishness put his family at risk. Because out here, poor decisions didn't just harm one man. They endangered the whole community. If Hodges failed, someone else would have to take him in, feed him, burn their wood to save his life. So their ridicule fear disguised as common sense. Still, Hodges worked with steady calm. He didn't defend himself. He didn't rush. He didn't argue. If the remarks reached him, and they did, he only offered a small nod, as if acknowledging their concern, without accepting their conclusion. But those who stepped inside his half-built cabin saw something different. Each stone chosen for shape and density. Mortar mixed to bond, not just stick. Sketches refined nightly. Air channels carved with intention. This wasn't a fireplace. This was a system. But no one knew what it was for. As October chilled into November, A few observant neighbors noticed something unsettling. Hodges wasn't stockpiling wood like the rest of them. While others chopped through the evenings, stacking cords beside their cabins, Hodges gathered wood at a pace that seemed relaxed, confident. He knew something they didn't, and that unsettled them even more. What was he planning? Why was he so certain? And what did those strange stone channels mean? Whispers turned into theories. Theories and rumors. Rumors, folklore before winter even arrived. The story of the man building a hearth big enough to heat the whole settlement spread through Briar Ridge like wildfire. Ironically, long before the hearth ever produced a flame. Before we continue, a brief note for those who appreciate true stories of forgotten ingenuity that shaped lives in extraordinary ways. If you value learning from history's overlooked thinkers, consider subscribing. It helps us share more meaningful stories like this with others who enjoy thoughtful, well-told history. As autumn deepened, skepticism didn't fade, it sharpened. Because everyone knew, talk means nothing. Only winter tells the truth. And when Hodges lit that massive hearth for the very first time, Briar Ridge found itself with a brand new subject of conversation. The settlement of Briar Ridge was like many small frontier communities carved out of the American wilderness in the mid-19th century, modest, practical, and held together by a fragile thread of shared survival. Life here demanded simplicity, conformity, and efficiency. Anything else was a risk few could afford. Families arrived with what they could carry, built what they absolutely needed, and lived with the constant awareness that winter was not a season. It was a threat. A miscalculation meant frostbite, starvation, or a quiet grave beneath the snow. This was the world William Hodges stepped into. For the people of Briar Ridge, a cabin wasn't just shelter. It was a lifeboat on a frozen ocean. Most homes were one-room structures, barely large enough for a table, bed, shelf, and the indispensable hearth. Every square foot had a purpose. A standard hearth burned hot, fast, and fierce. It demanded constant feeding, logs every 45 minutes to an hour during the worst cold. That meant long nights of interrupted sleep, shivering awake to rekindle the fire before the cabin's warmth evaporated into the night. Wood was currency, time was currency, and both were always in short supply. To a frontier family, space equaled survival. Extra room meant more stored food, more bedding, more firewood, or simply enough area for a large family to sleep without pressing against icy walls. When Hodges allocated nearly a quarter of his cabin to stone, the calculation in the minds of the townsfolk was simple. He was trading survival space for a risky experiment. And on the frontier, experiments got people killed. It is easy, from the comfort of modern hindsight, to imagine the locals as narrow-minded or stubborn. But there they had seen newcomers make fatal mistakes. Overly large windows that leaked heat, roofs not angled enough for snow runoff, and chimneys built shallowly that smoked the home. In Briar Ridge, tradition existed because it worked. So when they saw Hodges hauling massive stones into his tiny cabin, they weren't amused because he seemed foolish. They were alarmed because he seemed suicidal. A man who built wrong put more than himself at risk. When a family ran out of wood or their home failed, neighbors had to step in, share resources, or take them in. Survival here was communal. So skepticism was not cruelty, but self-protection disguised as criticism. The jokes about Hodges' hearth were a coping mechanism for fear. Little was known about William Hodges when he arrived, and he offered no brand stories about his past. But the careful precision in his work suggested a man who had observed, learned, and remembered. Although he rarely spoke of himself, fragments of his background slowly surfaced through casual conversation with the blacksmith and the general store owner. Hodges had spent several years traveling, far more than most settlers who stayed rooted to one region. He had worked as a hand for a trading outfit that moved goods between settlements, native communities, and early industrial towns. Along the way, he had seen different ways of surviving winter, and unlike many who traveled for trade, Hodges paid attention. He had watched families in Cherokee territory warm themselves through cold nights using heated stones wrapped in hides. He had observed German immigrant communities in the East who built kachelofen, masonry heaters that stored heat and released it slowly. He had even slept on warm, earthen beds in a tiny outpost near the Appalachians where heat retention was valued more than open flame. Hodges had remembered the fire, and more importantly, the ways people tamed it rather than fought it. Still, with no formal introduction to the town and no relatives to vouch for him, he remained the outsider. And frontier communities, even kind ones, had a boundary between us and newcomers. Hodges stood on the far side of it. The voices of the town had volume, and three in particular shaped the narrative around Hodges. Samuel McKenna, a broad-shouldered cattleman known for plain speech and strong opinions. He was the first to mock Hodges' Hearth publicly, and the loudest to repeat the joke. When he laughed, others followed. Mrs. Edith Palmer, the midwife, an unofficial voice of reason among women in the town. Though she never insulted Hodges, she quietly warned others that a man who ignores common wisdom does so at his own peril. Jonathan Reed, a young father of three whose cabin was closest to Hodges, Jonathan didn't mock, he worried. His concerns weren't rooted in pride, but in fear that his neighbor's design flaw might cause a fire that could spread. These characters added texture to the social fabric surrounding Hodges. Some mocked, some whispered, some simply watched the unfolding oddity with apprehension. Whenever Hodges walked into the general store, conversations shifted. If laughter erupted in his presence, people softened their voices. Even those who meant no harm, the hearth extended not outward, but lengthwise, almost like a raised platform, a bed of warmth, not just a fire pit. It wasn't wasteful. It was intentional. But intention meant little without results, and no one in Briar Ridge could yet see what Hodges saw in his mind. Not yet. As November approached, the winds sharpened, the first frost clung to roof shingles, and the settlement shifted from building to bracing mode. Chopping wood echoed through the mornings as axes split logs again and again, preparing for the worst. Neighbors stocked every corner with timber. Hodges, he gathered wood, but noticeably less. A small ember of curiosity had begun to glow in Briar Ridge, but it was faint, fragile, and buried beneath skepticism. That ember would ignite soon enough, because within weeks, the first real test was coming, and with it, the beginning of a quiet shift that no one, Hodges included, fully anticipated. The first true test of the season arrived not with a storm, but with a whisper. A sharp, biting cold that slipped into Briar Ridge overnight in mid-November. It wasn't the worst the region had seen, but it was enough to remind every family that the gentle autumn days were gone. Frost webbed across cabin windows by dawn, and the ponds at the settlement's edge wore a thin, glassy skin of ice. For most, the first cold snap was nothing more than a warning to stack wood higher and tighten drafty seams. But for William Hodges, it marked the moment to light his hearth in earnest. As the sun dipped and shadows stretched, thin columns of smoke rose from chimneys across the settlement. Inside cabin after cabin, fires crackled brightly. Flames roared. Families warmed their hands. And for a time, the cold outside felt like a distant inconvenience. At Hodges' cabin, however, the picture was different. He didn't heap his fire high. He didn't toss in log after log to force heat into the room. Instead, as twilight settled, Hodges carefully arranged a modest stack of wood in the firebox, not more than an evening's burn, and lit it with deliberate calm. The flames rose slowly, their heat drawn not outward into the room, but into the stone mass. The hearth absorbed the warmth like a sponge soaking up water. To any passerby, Looking through the window that evening, it might have seemed underwhelming. A small, unimpressive fire in a hearth far too large. But Hodges wasn't aiming for a burst of heat. He was building a reservoir. By the time the wood had burned down to embers, the hearth's stones had shifted from cold gray to a gentle, radiating warmth. Hodges closed the iron flue plate to trap heat inside the system, then set a kettle of water atop the warm surface, watching steam curl upward. No more wood was added that night. Just after dawn, a thin blue light spilled across Briar Ridge as families stirred awake to the familiar discomfort of early winter mornings. Fires needed rekindling. Chilled fingers sparked new flames. But at the cabin next door, Jonathan Reed paused. Something didn't make sense. His children shivered beneath blankets, their breath visible in the air. The fire had died during the night, and the cabin sat at a bracing chill. Jonathan rubbed his stiff hands together and threw 2 logs onto the coals, blowing gently until new flames caught. The heat would return, but slowly. He stepped outside to fetch kindling, pulling his coat tight, and stopped. Hodges emerged into the morning light as well, but with no visible discomfort. No rush. He simply stepped out, drew a long breath of sharp air, and set about his chores with sleeves rolled to his elbows. Jonathan frowned. "How cold did it get in your place overnight?" he asked, somewhat expecting Hodges to admit the failure of his oversized hearth. Hodges shrugged gently. "Cooler than when I banked the fire, but comfortable enough." Jonathan didn't press further, but something tugged at his curiosity. Comfortable? Without feeding a fire through the night? When he returned inside, the contrast struck him harder. Despite his fire being newly relit, Hodges' cabin had clearly retained more heat. Jonathan said nothing, but he noticed. The small observation didn't explode into excitement overnight, but it planted a seed. Within a few days, small remarks filtered through the settlement. Reed said that strange hearth of Hodges held heat till morning. Held heat? Without burning all night? He's lying, or he misunderstood. Skepticism remained the dominant force, but doubt had entered the room, subtle and quiet as the cold itself. McKenna, ever the loudest voice, dismissed the murmurs. "Beginner's luck. A warm night. It won't last," he declared at the general store, leaning back as others nodded along, more out of habit than conviction. But even he asked Reed, privately, quietly, if it was true. No one wanted to admit it aloud, yet the idea of a hearth that held warmth through the night tugged at the settlers like a promise too good to trust. A week later, the weather sharpened again. Not a storm, not yet, but another deeper cold front, pushing temperatures low enough that most families doubled their wood intake. This time, one of the townsmen, a thoughtful, observant carpenter named Elias Turner, decided to conduct a test of his own. Without telling anyone, he quietly paid Hodges a visit just before dusk. He found him kneeling by the hearth, sliding in the evening's firewood. "I hope you don't mind," Elias began, removing his hat respectfully. "I'm curious how your system works. Not here to mock." Hodges gave a welcoming nod. "Curiosity's a good companion in winter. Better than fear." Elias stayed only a short while, watching carefully how the fire was started, how the stones warmed. Then he thanked Hodges and returned home. The next morning, Elias made 2 rounds, first to Hodges' cabin, then to his own. He carried a simple hand thermometer, rare but not unheard of, and quietly recorded: Hodges' cabin, warm enough to sit comfortably without a coat. Elias's own cabin, cold enough that his fingertips numbed before the fire was rekindled. He did not share his findings publicly. Not yet. But in his eyes, the skepticism had fractured. Over the following days, the shift was not dramatic, but noticeable. Few neighbors slowed their steps when passing Hodges' cabin. Children pressed fingers to the outer stones, surprised to find them faintly warm, even late in the day. A couple of men lingered at the doorway, hoping for a glimpse inside without appearing overly curious. Even Mrs. Palmer, who rarely involved herself in idle gossip, commented softly one afternoon, "Ridicule ages poorly when truth proves young." But for all the subtle movement, public opinion had not yet turned. Briar Ridge respected results, but only undeniable ones, and the winter had only begun to reveal its teeth. Though the first cold snaps had provided intriguing results, none were harsh enough to silence McKenna or those who shared his doubts. "Let's see how he fares when the real cold comes," he barked one evening at the tavern. "Heat. Stones won't save him from January." A few men chuckled, but their laughter lacked the old confidence. McKenna sensed it, and it irritated him. Meanwhile, Hodges remained unchanged. He gathered wood methodically, measured his usage, and recorded nightly temperatures and burn times in a small notebook. His entries were not prideful, but scientific, almost clinical. He wasn't trying to prove his neighbors wrong. He was testing the system itself, and unbeknownst to the town, what he recorded in those early weeks would become the first documented comparison of thermal heating versus open-fire heating the settlement had ever seen. But the first real shift in Briar Ridge wouldn't come from data or from whispers or from curiosity. It would come from experience, when a night arrived that pushed families deeper into the cold than they had yet endured this season. A night where some would struggle, and one cabin would not. The stage was set. The first whispers of respect had begun to stir. But the proof was still too subtle to break the town's certainty. That was about to change, because December was approaching, and with it, the moment skepticism would begin to crack. December crept into Briar Ridge, not with the fury that January would unleash, but with a cold, methodical persistence that slowly tightened its grip around the settlement. Day by day, the ground stiffened. The river slowed to a sluggish crawl beneath forming ice, and the air carried the unmistakable bite of winter settling in for the long haul. It was during this month that curiosity in Hodges' backyard was present in town. Hearth shifted into quiet investigation, and the first undeniable evidence began to reshape opinions. The first week of December brought temperatures that plunged the settlement into a deeper chill. Families who once burned fires for comfort now burned them for survival. Smoke trailed constantly from chimneys across Briar Ridge, staining the horizon with a hazy charcoal ribbon. Inside most cabins, the routine was exhausting but familiar. Add wood before bed, wake up at midnight to feed the fire, wake again at 3 or 4 a.m. to prevent the cabin from freezing. For some, especially families with infants or aging parents, sleep became fragmented, an hourly battle against the creeping cold. But in Hodges' cabin, the rhythm was startlingly different. He lit his fire in the early evening, allowed it to burn for a few hours, and then let it die. And yet, long after embers had faded, the stones radiated a gentle, consistent warmth deep into the night and well into morning. Those who visited began noticing something they couldn't deny. Hodges wasn't chopping wood at the same frantic pace as the rest of the town. One frigid evening in the second week of December, a knock sounded at Hodges' door. It was Elias Turner, the carpenter who had quietly conducted his own comparison. "Mind if I bring someone along tomorrow evening?" Elias asked. "Someone who should see for himself." Hodges, as always, offered a calm, welcoming nod. The next night, Elias returned, not with a crowd, but with Jonathan Reed, his neighbor. Jonathan carried a guarded expression, part curiosity, part pride resisting concession. As the three men stepped inside, Reed paused. He expected heat near the hearth, but this was different. The entire cabin held a pervasive, even warmth that seemed to wrap around them like a thick, woolen cloak. Elias gestured for Reed to place his hand against the side of the elevated stone platform. Reed did. Slowly, his skepticism shifted to surprise. "It's warm all the way through." Even though the fire's been out for hours, Elias added. Reed withdrew his hand, conflicted. He wanted to dismiss it, to claim coincidence, but the evidence was physical, undeniable. Hodges didn't boast. He didn't gloat. He simply explained, gently. The stones hold the heat longer than flames ever could. Fire burns fast, but if you teach the heat where to stay, it stays. Reed left that night unsettled, not by failure or envy, but by the realization that what he had mocked might actually change the way his fam. Word began to spread more earnestly now, and with curiosity building, Hodges finally agreed to explain the how to a small group, not formally, but through natural conversation that spread like wildfire across town. To keep it simple, he described the hearth like this. Think of heat like water. A bucket with a hole leaks quickly. That's an open fireplace. But if you seal the bucket and fill it with something that absorbs the water first, it releases it slowly, drop by drop, long after the source is gone. He didn't use technical terms like thermal mass or conductive retention, though he understood them. Instead, he used frontier language, metaphors his neighbors could visualize. He demonstrated with simple logic. A standard fireplace sends most heat up the chimney and out. His hearth kept heat inside the stone, then released it into the cabin gradually. Instead of burning wood constantly for heat, he burned wood briefly to charge the stone. One woman later described it perfectly at the communal well. He doesn't heat the air, he heats the room itself. And that single explanation began spreading faster than the cold. Inevitably, a few decided to imitate the design, without understanding its structure. One man, a well-meaning but impatient settler named Harold Whitcomb, attempted to enlarge his fireplace with field stones he stacked haphazardly around the firebox, believing he could recreate Hodges' results with half the effort. The outcome? Smoke-filled cabin, scorching hot stones that cracked overnight, and a frustrated Harold blaming the idea rather than his execution. The failure served Hodges more than success might have, because the town didn't mock the concept. Instead, they suddenly recognized that what Hodges built wasn't just big, it was precise. It wasn't about bigger, it was about smart. By mid-December, Hodges' cabin had become something of a quiet marvel for those lucky enough to step inside. Children resting on the warm stone bed let out small sighs of relief as the heat seeped through blankets. Tools left on the surface carried a pleasant warmth. Boots dried overnight without scorching. Even bread dough placed near the hearth rose more evenly, a detail that spread fast among the women of the settlement. To those who had only known fire that burned fast and fierce, the idea of heat that lingered felt almost magical. But Hodges always framed it not as invention, but rediscovery. He shared fragments, never condescendingly. He'd seen Cherokee elders heat stone pits for night-long warmth. He'd watched German families sleep beside masonry stoves that radiated heat till dawn. He'd learned, quietly, that the world had more than one answer to winter's cruelty. And now, he was applying the best lessons he'd witnessed into one system, right here in Briar Ridge. Yet for all this, admiration remained whispered, cautious, almost secretive. Why? Because acknowledging Hodges' success meant admitting their own certainty had been flawed. No one likes learning that the idea they laughed at was brilliant, especially when that brilliance might soon mean the difference between enduring winter with dignity or suffering through it. Still, interest rose. Footsteps lingered more frequently outside Hodges' cabin. Neighbors asked subtle questions. How much wood he used, how often he burned, how long warmth lasted. A quiet shift was underway. On the final Sunday before Christmas, Briar Ridge hosted a small community supper at the chapel. Frost clung to every window, and breath misted in the air, even indoors. Families arrived bundled in layers, rubbing hands for warmth. But when Hodges entered, he removed his coat and kept it off. No shivering, no visible discomfort. That simple, unspoken moment moved through the room like a draft. But instead of chilling, it warmed something inside people. Recognition. Some turned away, others stared. A few shared glances that silently admitted, there is something to what he's built. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but the first crack had formed in the wall of doubt. If stories like this spark your curiosity about the ingenious solutions our ancestors once used and how many we've forgotten, feel free to stay with this channel by subscribing. There are more true accounts like this one that deserve to be remembered. As December waned, temperatures continued to fall. Nights grew longer, fires burned hotter, and the forest, once filled with abundance, began to thin under constant harvesting. Some families were already counting their remaining wood supply with unease. Yet Hodges still used less. The whispers had changed tone. They were no longer mocking. They were hungry for answers. But answers would not come through conversation or comparison. They would come through crisis. Because while December tested comfort, January would test survival. January arrived without mercy. The new year did not dawn. It descended like a predator upon Briar Ridge. A brutal cold front swept across the region, the kind spoken of in old letters and later retold as legend. Temperatures plunged far beyond what most settlers had prepared for, and the winter that had seemed harsh in December now felt almost gentle in comparison. The river froze solid, thick enough to bear the weight of a wagon. Trees cracked in the forest with sharp, echoing snaps exploding from the cold. The sky itself seemed hard and metallic, the air slicing at lungs with every breath. Inside most cabins, the cold became a living presence, an unwelcome guest that refused to be driven out, no matter how fiercely fires were fed. This was not a month of endurance. It was a month of survival. The first week of January drained wood piles faster than anyone anticipated. Families burned more than double their usual nightly supply. The first week of January drained wood piles faster than anyone anticipated. Families burned more than double their usual nightly supply just to keep frost from creeping across their blankets. Babies cried through the night, their tiny bodies struggling to hold warmth. Elderly parents lay bundled beneath quilts, whispering prayers that morning would come quickly. Then came the night that Briar Ridge would speak of for years, the night when the wind rose like a wild, vengeful spirit and battered the settlement with temperatures that scraped dangerously close to life-threatening. The cold was so severe that lantern oil thickened and glass chimneys frosted from the inside. The wind forced smoke back down chimneys, choking those who tried to stoke their fires higher. Some families dared not open their doors to fetch more wood, terrified the cold outside would run. By midnight, several cabins reached near freezing temperatures indoors, even with fires burning. It was then that the first cries for help broke through the storm. Jonathan Reed, Hodges' nearest neighbor, was the first to fall into real danger. His youngest daughter, Emma, had been coughing for days. The cold only aggravated it. Tonight, despite the fire blazing, the temperature refused to stay high enough to keep her stable. Wrapped in blankets, her little body trembled violently. Jonathan placed another log onto the fire, then another, feeding it desperately. But the flames offered only momentary relief before the chill reclaimed the cabin's air like a greedy thief. Jonathan's wife, Miriam, held Emma to her chest, voice strained with worry. "She's getting colder, John. She's burning inside, but her skin, feel her hands." Jonathan removed his glove and touched his daughter's fingers. They were icy, almost stiff. Panic flickered in his eyes. Their wood supply, once neatly stacked, was now alarmingly low. By dawn, they might have nothing left. Jonathan made a decision he once would have sworn he'd never entertain. "We're going to Hodges' cabin." Stepping outside that night was like stepping into another world of frozen air and swirling white fury. The wind struck Jonathan like a wall, stealing his breath and nearly knocking him off balance. He wrapped Emma tightly, carried her against his chest, and Miriam held onto his coat as they forced their way across the snow-buried ground. The distance was short on any normal day, but under that murderous cold, each step felt like crossing a frozen battlefield. By the time they reached Hodges' door, Miriam's lips were blue, and Emma had gone frighteningly still. Jonathan pounded on the door with urgency, not the polite knock of a neighbor, but a plea for help. The door opened almost instantly. Warmth spilled out like a wave. Inside Hodges' cabin, the scene could not have contrasted more sharply with the world outside. There was no roaring fire, only a faint glow behind the iron plate and a soft amber warmth radiating from the stone hearth. The air held a steady, comforting heat, like the inside of a heavy quilt. A kettle simmered gently in the corner, filling the air with a thin, fragrant steam. Hodges ushered them inside, without hesitation, closing the door quickly behind them to protect the warmth. Miriam nearly broke into tears at the sudden relief. Jonathan laid Emma on the warm stone platform. Hodges retrieved a wool blanket already warmed from the hearth and covered her carefully. "She needs heat slowly," he said calmly, placing a hand near Emma's head, not touching, just assessing. "Too fast and she'll shock. Let the warmth draw in." Jonathan stared around the cabin. No frantic wood burning, no smoke clouding the room, no panicked atmosphere. Just peaceful, even heat. "How?" he whispered, voice cracking. Not from cold, but from awe and embarrassment. Hodges offered a small, understanding nod. "Heat given all at once abandons you just as quickly. But heat taught to stay becomes a companion through the night." Jonathan had no reply. Shame and gratitude battled behind his eyes. That night, the Reed family was not the only one pushed to the brink. Within the next hour, 3 more knocks came at Hodges' door. Hesitant, ashamed, desperate. Harold Whitcomb arrived with his wife by 2 a.m. 7 people from 4 different families were gathered inside Hodges' cabin, some for warmth, others for safety, all bound by reluctant acknowledgement. The man they mocked was the man who could help them survive. Outside, the winds raged. Inside, silence settled over the room, the kind not born of comfort, but of realization. As the night wore on and bodies thawed, the atmosphere shifted from shock to quiet humility. At one point, Harold Whitcomb, shivering less now, but still shaken, finally spoke. "I owe you an apology, Hodges. I thought you were foolish, wasteful. Turns out I was blind." And pride, like frost, began to crack. By sunrise, the storm eased, but the consequences were etched across Briar Ridge. Several cabins had ice forming on the inside walls. One family's well pump had frozen solid. Another had lost nearly all their wood overnight, forcing the father to chop more. And men who once scoffed now found themselves approaching him, not with ridicule, but with tentative questions. "What exactly did you put under the stones? How deep is the base? Do you think it could be built in an existing cabin, or only new ones?" Hodges answered with patience, never with pride, but he made one thing clear. "I'll explain it in full to everyone, at once, not in fragments." And so, the settlement decided, almost unanimously, to gather at Hodges' Stones cabin on the following evening. The same cabin once laughed at would now become a classroom and a turning point for the entire community. The crisis of January had broken more than the settlement's confidence. It had broken the belief that tradition was unquestionable. Now, the question was no longer, is Hodges wrong? The question had become, how has he been right all along, and how can we learn from him? What the community was about to hear wouldn't end the wisdom of listening before laughing. Because the next evening, when Briar Ridge gathered inside that warm cabin, Hodges revealed the full truth behind the hearth. The night after the crisis, Briar Ridge gathered with a different energy than the one that filled the chapel in December. Then, They had arrived curious. Now they arrived humbled, attentive, and in need. A storm had passed, but the cold had not relented. The settlement felt bruised by winter's hand, and beneath the surface of daily survival ran a quiet, collective admission. As dusk fell, lanterns bobbed through the snow as families made their way to Hodges' cabin, not to scoff or observe, but to learn. They came in twos and threes, stomping snow from their boots, breath fogging in the air as they slipped inside. The moment each crossed the threshold, the warmth wrapped around them, steady, reliable, and deep. It was the kind of heat that greeted, not blasted, the kind that felt like safety. There was no large fire roaring in the hearth, just that familiar soft radiance from the stone bed, glowing faintly from the previous evening's burn. Hodges had intentionally timed it so the heat would be at its most demonstrative level. Fire long gone, warmth still present. By the time the last family arrived, more than 24 people filled the room, some standing shoulder to shoulder. Conversation stayed hushed. Even the children sensed that what was happening was important. Hodges looked out over the faces, tired, hopeful, anxious, and offered a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you for coming. I'm glad you're here." No pride, no triumph, just warmth in his voice like the hearth beside him. Hodges began not with explanation, but with acknowledgement, directed at the one man who needed it most. "Mr. McKenna," he said, turning toward the cattleman near the door. "You were right to question what I built." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. McKenna stiffened, caught off guard. "In a place where winter rules our lives, caution is wisdom. I never took your doubt as insult. We survive out here by trusting what's worked." McKenna blinked, a crack forming in the armor of his pride. But Hodges continued gently. "Every good idea began as something unfamiliar once." The room exhaled. Hodges hadn't embarrassed him. He had honored him. McKenna gave the smallest nod. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was permission to learn. Hodges had opened the door for unity. Hodges didn't lecture, he told a story. He spoke of his travels, of harsh winters he had seen, of staying with Cherokee families who warmed stones in pits for night-long protection against cold, and of a German family in Pennsylvania who slept beside a masonry stove that seemed to hold the sun inside it. "I realized," he said, resting a hand on the warmed stone surface, "that the Cherokee warmed people while the Germans warmed homes. I wanted both." He knelt beside the hearth, not as a teacher in front of a class, but as a man sharing something precious. Fire burns fast, too fast. It takes and takes, wood, time, sleep. But stone remembers heat. He tapped the side of the hearth gently. "What you're feeling now is last night's fire." People leaned in, absorbing each word with a hunger born from lived suffering. Hodges slid open the iron plate and added a small stack of wood, not more than what most used for an hour's burn. He lit it with a taper and stepped back. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary fire, but Hodges narrated what was happening in real time. "You'll notice, I don't open the flue all the way. I draw the heat into the stone channel first, let it travel through here." He traced the path across the hearth's length, so the stone absorbs it before it reaches the chimney. The fire crackled softly as the demonstration continued. He encouraged those nearest to place their palms gently on the stone as heat began to move. "Feel how it warms evenly, not in one spot, but across the whole surface. The heat spreads through the mass, like water saturating soil." Eyes widened. It was one thing to hear the concept, another to feel it happening. Hodges invited questions, not with authority, but with generosity. Mrs. Palmer was first. "Can a hearth like this be built in a cabin that's already standing?" "Yes," Hodges said, with care. "It must be supported from the ground, but it can be done." Harold Whitcomb, humbled from his failed attempt, raised a hand reluctantly. "And if someone were to get it wrong, what's the danger?" Hodges smiled gently, not mockingly, but kindly. "The danger is in rushing. Stone must heat slow or it cracks. Mortar must breathe or it traps. This hearth is not a wall of stone. It is a living thing. It must be built to warm, not to burn. People nodded. His answer wasn't just instructional. It was memorable. Even McKenna, after a long moment of silence, spoke quietly. What if we all built one? Would there be enough stone? Hodges nodded. There is enough in the riverbed and ridge. Not everyone needs mine. You need your own, built for your family, your space. I'll help you find the right stone. It was the closest thing McKenna. People no longer saw Hodges as the outsider with strange ideas. They saw him as someone who carried an inheritance of knowledge that could protect them too. Before leaving, families discussed the matter amongst themselves. A low hum of conversation filled the cabin. We should build ours before next winter. If we start in March, we'll have time. Could 3 families work together on one? How much wood do you think we'll save? It was no longer if, it was when. Some asked Hodges if he would teach a group tomorrow. Others asked if he could draw a simple blueprint. He agreed to both, but he made one request. If we build these, we build them right. Together. No man left alone to do it wrong. Not a demand, a promise of support. And in frontier life, that meant as the night drew to a close, families gathered coats and children, stepping back into the cold. But the air outside felt less threatening now, not because the temperature had risen, but because fear had been replaced with knowledge. Mrs. Palmer lingered at the door and turned back to Hodges. You may have saved us once already, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But tonight, you gave us the means to save ourselves. Hodges shook his head gently. Not save, prepare. Winter always returns. Now we'll return with wisdom. One by one, neighbors nodded to him, not with the casual dip of politeness, but with the recognition one gives a man whose actions have earned respect. Night, the outsider had become a pillar of the community. As the door closed and Hodges returned to the quiet warmth of his cabin, the fire he had lit earlier burned low. He slid the iron plate shut, allowing the heat to sink. Winter did not ease quickly that year. January's cruelty lingered well into February, and Briar Ridge still faced bitter nights and dwindling wood supplies. Yet something was undeniably different now. Fear no longer ruled the settlement. Knowledge did. Families who once dreaded nightfall now managed their heat wisely, conserving energy with strategies Hodges had shared. Neighbors began assisting one another with insulation, draft sealing, and fire banking techniques. Even those who hadn't yet built a masonry hearth benefited from the lessons learned. Hodges' cabin was no longer an oddity. It had become a symbol of resilience. As soon as the first hints of spring softened the ground and the river thawed, the settlement gathered at the ridge to begin what would become a community project. Stones were selected with care, not haste. Hodges walked the line of gathered rocks, teaching as he went. Choose the ones that hold heat, not the right stone is the one that listens to the fire. By early summer, 3 more homes had functioning masonry hearths. By autumn, nearly every family in Briar Ridge had either built one or planned to begin before the next frost. The following winter, though still cold, was met with confidence rather than dread. Sleep returned to the settlers. Wood piles lasted longer. Children woke warm, and for the first time since the founding of Briar Ridge, winter felt like a season to endure, not a force to survive. The design evolved as more families built their own versions. Some added raised backs for warming clothes. Others extended platforms for sleeping spaces or cooking surfaces. It became not only a heating system, but a cornerstone of home life. A tradition had begun, born not from conformity, but from curiosity humbled into wisdom. The settlement seemed better prepared, healthier, more rested than others they had visited. They observed warm sleeping platforms, stone hearths radiating heat hours after the fire had died, and families eager to share what they had learned. News spread to neighboring settlements. Some scoffed at the idea. just as Briar Ridge once had. But others listened, remembering the harsh winters they themselves had endured. Within a few years, the idea had traveled to homesteads along nearby valleys and overland trade routes. By the next decade, masonry hearths of this style, adapted, improved, rebuilt, could be found in cabins far beyond the ridge that first embraced them. Like all good knowledge, it began to outgrow the man who carried it. William Hodges never sought credit, nor did he consider himself the inventor of anything revolutionary. To him, the hearth was simply an example of what could happen when cultures listened to one another and shared what worked. He had seen wisdom in Cherokee fire pits. He had slept beside German stone stoves. He had shaped both into something that fit the life of a frontier settler. But the legacy he left was larger than a hearth. It was the idea that survival improves when we learn before we judge. Years later, townsfolk still spoke of that bitter January and the night so many families gathered in Hodges' warm cabin. Some recounted the night with humility, others with gratitude, but all remembered the moment the community chose learning over pride. Children who once slept on the warm stone bed grew up believing that sharing knowledge was as essential as chopping wood before winter. And perhaps that was Hodges' greatest gift, far more valuable than radiant heat. Looking back now, it's easy to overlook the significance of what happened in that small settlement. But history isn't shaped only by wars, inventions, or great cities. Sometimes it turns on quiet human moments, when one person dares to do something different and others choose to listen. The hearth that once sparked ridicule became the heart of a community's resilience. And long after Hodges passed on, the warmth of his idea continued to travel, home to home, family to family, winter to winter. Even today, the principle remains unchanged. Heat can be forced, or it can be taught to stay. Wisdom can be hoarded, or it can be shared. One brings comfort for a moment, the other for generations. If stories like this remind you that forgotten knowledge still has the power to guide us today, feel free to share this video with someone who would appreciate it. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what's the temperature there right now? I read as many comments as I can, and your responses help keep these stories alive. Powerful changes in history begin with a warm room, a listening ear, and the courage of one person willing